Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, my dear brothers and sisters. Greetings of peace and blessings to you and yours. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Arshia Ali-Khan, and it is my honor to be serving as the Chief Executive Officer of the Muslim Legal Fund of America since 2020. On behalf of our Board of Directors and our staff, I welcome you. As I begin, I want to affirm for those of you who are new to our mission that MLFA has spent the past 22 years preparing and mastering the law on constitutional and national security matters as they relate to Muslims and Muslim organizations nationwide. MLFA launched our nonprofit division in 2016. We began our mission to defend you and yours. However, over time, we learned that protecting you and educating you was equally important. In light of the catastrophic war in Gaza and the occupied territories, it has become crucial for Muslim nonprofits to understand and navigate the legal landscape surrounding aid initiatives and compliance concerns. We at MLFA, sadly and gratefully, are aware of what direct and indirect consequences Muslims and Muslim organizations are facing. We recognize the urgency of aiding conflict zones while respecting legal boundaries. Our legal experts will address key legal considerations to help your nonprofits carry out their noble missions without jeopardizing your organizational integrity. Today, we will be overviewing preventative action, free speech, employment compliance, the immigration perspective, and sending money overseas. We have prepared this virtual experience to give you an opportunity to ask your questions, share your thoughts and concerns, so we can continue to educate you and protect you before we ever have to defend you. Please note that today is not meant to be direct case and specific legal advice, so please keep your questions general on this call. However, call us, email us, or submit an intake for all and any specific questions that you may have. We are here to serve you. Our 4 legal departments are present with us today. Our nonprofit department, led by Saleem, our immigration litigation department, led by Kathryn Brady, our civil litigation department, led by Christina, and our criminal defense department, led by Charlie Swift. Each of our leading attorneys will provide you with an opening so you can understand the scope and the breadth of our work in each of these areas as they relate to nonprofit compliance here in the United States. Thereafter, we will open up for your questions. I'd also like to thank Jawad Khan, our operations manager, who will be navigating us behind the scenes. Thank you again for joining us today. And with that, I ask Sana Saleem, our nonprofit department lead, to start us off. Bismillah and welcome.
Introduction. Okay? Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I will start off with just a disclaimer. If you'll bear with me, I'll just read this off. MLFA wishes to inform the audience of this virtual workshop that the legal information provided is general in nature and should not be relied upon as legal advice to anyone. The attorneys in MLFA's legal division only give legal advice after full consideration of all relevant information relating to each individual situation. Our attorneys form our relationships with clients only after direct consultation and careful consideration of all relevant facts. Please contact mlfa.org for a consultation. And with that, I will kind of dive right in. Are you ready? This is the question that we are asking to you all, to our nonprofit organizations. I understand that many people, including myself, are feeling helpless, hopeless, right now with regard to Gaza. There is a sense of urgency of what we can do, how we can help, how we can do it, and how we can hurry. But before your nonprofit thinks about doing work externally, please make sure to look internally as well. My job at MLFA is to engage in preventative measures with my nonprofits so they aren't in a situation where they're having to call Christy in our civil department because they received a civil investigation demand like the one that you see here, or worse, in a situation where they're calling Charlie in our criminal department for something like an alleged, material support to terrorism claim. In light of the past 45 days, Muslim organizations are getting renewed attention from the government. And I just want to remind you that the government does not need probable cause to ask your organization for documents like the ones, that you see on the screen. So in order to make sure that you are ready, let's get started with some of the basics. So if you run a nonprofit today, right now, I want you to use these next few slides that I go over as your checklist, your kind of internal benchmark to complete a self-evaluation, a self-analysis of your organization today at your next board meeting, whenever that may be, to make sure that your organization not only has these things, but that they're updated and accessible. So these are the 4 main categories that our MLFA legal screenings look at. If you're not familiar, I'll back up a second. MLFA offers nonprofit governance, risk compliance, legal screenings for 501c3 and 501c4 organizations. Usually those organizations come to us after they've already been established, and we go over all of their internal documents. So that's kind of the starting point for these slides. So these are the 4 categories. Oh, sorry, go back. These are the 4 categories that I look at when I do a legal screening. So governance, controls, financials, and regulatory compliance. Governance is the big picture. So we're looking at how a nonprofit is administered, how they make strategic decisions, accountability, things like that. Controls, we look at day-to-day operations. So these are policies and procedures that are in place for your organization, for your staff, your volunteers who are running the day-to-day. Financials, it's pretty self-explanatory, but the processes that you have in place to protect your organization, to mitigate any risk of fraud or prevention in that regard. And then, of course, there are the regulatory compliance, so state and IRS regulations. So now we'll dive into governance, which is our first category. So I'm not going to read you this list, but you have it here. And I believe we'll have these slides for you all on our website after today's presentation. But these are some of the basics. And I feel like they get glossed over often because everyone assumes that someone else has already taken care of them, that they've been done correctly, or that they've been updated. And oftentimes that's not the case. So a couple governance issues, big picture, like I mentioned, board members provide foresight, oversight, and insight. I once read to think about board members as kind of sitting up in a crow's nest, scanning the horizon for any potential storms coming your way or any rainbows. And so I like that, metaphor in that sense that you are the stewards of your organization. Roles and responsibilities is a big one. And that relationship between board members, employees, volunteers is a seemingly simple concept, but with varying personalities within an organization, sometimes it's the lines can get a little blurry. So laying out clear job descriptions is essential to the success of your organization. And that kind of takes me into my next slide, which talks about 15 nonprofit board governance mistakes. And this is from charitylawyerblog.com. I highly encourage you to click on this link and read the whole article because it goes deeper into each of these categories. Again, I'm not going to read through all of them. I've starred the ones. Oh, I'm not sure if those stars are there. Okay, I will just dive into a couple of them that I felt or that I have seen repeatedly with my clients and that I feel are good primers for this discussion. So failure to understand fiduciary duties. This is one of those concepts that you see in the very beginning of the organization, and new people come into the mix, new board members who may not have gotten the primer on this. And those are the 3 fiduciary duties are the duty of good faith, which is adhering to applicable laws and regulations, duty of care, that means prudent use of all assets, including not just the facility, but all of your people as well. And then the duty of loyalty. So making sure that the decisions that you make as a board member are in fact in the best interest of the nonprofit corporation, not any individual within the group. So everything that you do as a board member, you must keep these 3 duties in mind. The second one I wanted to highlight is micromanaging the staff. This is one that I see often. There are many board members that can cross the line or blur the line by requesting or demanding things from the CEO, the staff, the volunteers. Like I said, the board's key functions are to provide foresight, insight, and oversight, and not to necessarily interfere in that day-to-day, which is where the board roles and responsibilities comes into play. On the other hand, the staff should also not invite that micromanagement by asking the board member, to take on some of these day-to-day roles and responsibilities. So it's a two-way street. And I am cognizant of the fact that many times smaller organizations don't have enough people to kind of make these clear distinctions. And so I keep that in mind as I'm giving you this advice. But for larger organizations where you are able to distinguish, it is, incumbent that it's incumbent on you all to make those distinctions, creating specific job descriptions for each and every board member themselves, because each and every member is bringing something different to the table. And so kind of laying out those expectations from the get-go before those board members come on board is crucial to the success of your organization. So moving on to controls. So this is, like I said, the day-to-day operations policies. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but this is a category that we look at in our legal screenings of what you have and what you don't have. Not every policy will apply to every nonprofit, as I have written there, but I'd say for the most part, the ones in the left-hand column should apply to your organization, regardless of how big or small it is. Those are some pretty important ones. And then another note, more policies doesn't equal better. I've also seen organizations that, maybe not 100 policies, but if you have 100 policies, I guess my question is, what difference does it make if no one knows about them, if no one's read them, if they're not accessible or no one knows how or where to access them? So really hone in on the ones that are applicable to your organization, that make the most sense for your organization, and then, make sure that they're available. Make sure everyone in the organization knows what the complaint process is or knows that there is a whistleblower policy. It's not on the screen, but I actually have a hard copy of the 990 here. And if you take a look at that, part 6 of the Form 990 is governance, management, and disclosure. So there's a whole page, and I'm not going to obviously read these out to you, but keep in mind that even on the 990 that the IRS asks for, that you fill out every year, it says, does your organization have a written conflict of interest policy? Does it have a whistleblower policy? Do you have a document retention and destruction policy? So it's very easy to, cross-reference the 990 with what you have and make sure they are in alignment for some of these key policies that you have in place. So the next category we're going to talk about is the financials. So I've kind of broken them up here into external and internal, making sure you have accounting software. Nowadays, it is really important with that Donate Now button to have some kind of cybersecurity software or program or company that you use, because there is a very real risk of that information being stolen, protecting your donor list and things like that. So make sure there's process in place. Make sure the person signing the checks is not the person writing the checks. There should always be more than one person involved in those types of decisions. And sometimes, like I said before, some of these things have not been looked at since the organization started a year ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. So just keeping in mind that, one of the things that should be as part of your overall governance and compliance is looking at your bylaws and policies handbook every however many years, every 3 years is what we recommend. Externally, Charlie will be going over international giving, but I just wanted to hit quickly on UBIT, the unrelated business income tax. So this is the tax that even 501c3s have to pay if you are, if you have a side hustle, if you will. If your organization decides to start selling merchandise or T-shirts, you'd have to file this 990T and pay the tax on that. If your organization rents out your gym facility for parties or something like that, I know a lot of mosques will do that. So that should be filed separately in your 990T. If your organization rents out your parking spaces, if you're close to like a stadium or arena and you charge $10 a car for parking during games or something like that. So those are some quick examples of what UBIT would cover, and just want to flag that if that is something that your organization is doing. Again, those things are not related. The definition is that it's not related to what your exempt purpose is. So if merchandise isn't your exempt purpose, then that would count as being taxable. So the last category here is regulatory compliance. This is, kind of the basic annual state filings, filing your 990s, like I mentioned. What I wanted to highlight actually was two things. But first, I would recommend going to your state attorney general's office and just bookmarking that website, because any updates to your filings, to your state annual filings will be on that website. It's always really helpful just to have it bookmarked, and then you're able to go back and check. One thing I wanted to highlight, though, the second thing, is that the state charitable solicitation license. I've actually done an entire webinar just on state charitable solicitation, because every state has different rules. There are about 42 states that require it. Texas, for example, only requires it with certain law enforcement agencies that solicit by telephone or veterans organizations. So it's really, really narrow and specific for who is required to get this charitable solicitation license. And then the reason I wanted to mention this also is because that screenshot that I showed you earlier is from an actual complaint, and the government in that case is basically flagging a Muslim nonprofit for allegedly failing to have on hand this charitable solicitation license. So it's something that is seemingly so minor, but now it's opened the doors for the nonprofit to have to provide all these documents, and you just never know. One thing can lead to another. They can ask for the charitable solicitation or open the case based on charitable solicitation, and they may find a slew of other things. Maybe your financials are not in order, maybe something else. So we just don't want to give them that green light to open the door to any of that. So in conclusion, we'll just go to this last slide. And again, I just wanted to really reemphasize, these are the types of documents. I'm not sure if you all can see that, but copies of all solicitation materials, including like the flyers, brochures, mailers, how you're asking, for donors for money, meeting minutes, W-2s, W-3s, 990s, all of that. And then all solicitation used in connection with seeking that. So that goes back to the charitable solicitation. But these are very routine, very ordinary nonprofit documents. And so my question and my hope for you all is that, are you ready? Are you ready if the government comes knocking on your organization's door tomorrow or next week or next month asking for these documents? We sure hope so. So now I will hand it over to Kate, who will go over some immigration compliance issues.
There we go. All right. Well, good afternoon. And I think that what Sana said was a great lead into what I do, because I also have a lot of regulations that are the basis of what immigration is. And I think it's also one of the areas where people think about it last. And I want you to make sure that all of these issues are rising to the top, so that you're not forgetting any one thing that could open the door to all these government agencies who are all too happy to find issues that they can then make assumptions about your charity that are unfavorable and will just maybe bring a lot of damage. So, all right, let me give you a couple of points here. So let's move on to the next slide. All right. So if you have employees, you are under the same obligations that for-profit companies are. You want to make sure that you have properly screened your employees for authorization to work and that they have legal status in the United States. Because even if they are volunteering for your organization, those are considered jobs that could be paid, and that could impact them in any future immigration benefits that they have, but it could also impact you. And we'll kind of go over some of those civil and criminal issues in a later part of my presentation. But I see quite often in organizations that are small, especially, they want to hire friends and relatives who are maybe here, visiting for a few months. They need some maybe pocket money, walking around money, as we might say, and they're not in a status that allows for work authorization. I would just really caution you against doing that, because that opens you up to investigations and audits from organizations that I know nobody wants to have in their facilities, which are Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, and the Department of Labor, or DOL. So let's go on. Next slide. All right. So the problem with immigration is that there is a lot of push from both sides as far as hiring practices. And this is where it's great that we have both an immigration and an employment law expert here at MLFA, because there are many things that seem to be okay that are for immigration compliance that can then creep over into being discrimination. I saw in the last week there was two very large tech companies that settled with the government for hundreds of violations, and I think millions of dollars, where they had preferred immigrants over U.S. workers. And so in a lot of ways, I think when we in the U.S. think about discrimination, we're typically thinking about the opposite, right? People who maybe are not U.S. born citizens are the ones who are not being treated fairly in the employment context. But it's a balancing act, because you can't then tip the scale to the other way. You can't prefer anyone based on citizenship, whether it's U.S. citizenship or a foreign citizenship, on their immigration status, whether you're trying to hire people who have lawful permanent residence or citizenship or a work authorization, or maybe asylum or refugee. You need to be neutral, I guess, is the issue there. And you cannot be preferring anybody based on their national origin. So a lot of that is going to be pushed around, like I said, by employment law, which is Christie's area. And those are issues where you're going to look at people who maybe have special skills for your organization, maybe language skills or cultural competency skills. And so I can't tell you that there's any formula for getting it right. I would just say, if you have questions, these are areas where consulting attorneys as you go through things to hire people, or consulting with HR companies, is a great idea. I don't know how many organizations have opted into the E-Verify system, but this is a system that the U.S. government allows you to verify on the I-9 form, that is the federal form to allow you to know that somebody is work authorized, and then it gets cross-referenced with other databases. The interesting thing to me about this form is it was actually implemented in the late 80s, early 90s in response to the U.S. giving asylum to immigrants who had come from some of the countries who were giving us maybe farm labor and things like that. And so this was the concession that they made. So now employers kind of become federal compliance immigration officers. And it's sometimes hard because there are a lot of different pieces that come along with that. And so again, you can't prefer somebody because of their immigration status, but you also have to be very careful not to dismiss somebody in the hiring process because you don't understand whether or not they're work authorized. And as I say here, there can also be some civil penalties, which money is always important. So we don't want to risk your donor's money with penalties. Let's move on. So as you can see, there is one criminal violation if you are engaging in a pattern or practice of hiring, recruiting, or referring people who are unauthorized for employment. That is very unlikely that most people are doing that. I mean, jail is a big thing when you're talking about violations in a regulatory area. So that has to be one that is pervasive, not just a once you made a mistake thing. But as you can see from the other side, there's a lot of easy ones to do. Failing to do that I-9, having the unlawful discrimination in the hiring, just all kinds of things that are easy, just like in the compliance issues with your nonprofit organization. These are things that if you don't have somebody dedicated to HR, or you don't have anybody really kind of watching that piece of your organization, if you choose to hire people and their employees, or even somebody who's a consultant, you could be opening yourself up to further investigations. So let's go one more. Oh, and there we go. So I'm not going to talk about all the terrible bad things that can happen in immigration. I know a lot of you have gone through the immigration process, but I would just say that watch for these things that are easy to slip up on, and have somebody who has that on their radar, and don't just have it be an afterthought. So I'm going to pass it on to Christina.
Thank you, Kate. I appreciate that. So what I want to do is run through with you some of the areas that affect free speech, that affect a lot of what we see going on, a lot of things that we see in the news, and how that can affect a nonprofit as well as specifically a religious organization. So we can go to the first slide for this section. Okay. So this is free speech. What are some of the things that imams and also other business leaders can say or not say? And at the top of the screen, in the part with the green background, what we have is the text of the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So all of that together sounds great. It sounds like awesome. We can do pretty much what we want. That covers a lot of ground. That covers a lot of things. But as most of you know, that's not necessarily how it plays out. So we want to go over where some of the risks are, and also where we know that there are some presumptions that may get some, especially nonprofit entities, into trouble, or where it may also lead to some difficulty with the employees, just even in the employment relationship. So first of all, you don't want to necessarily just say anything. There's not a complete immunity. There are some additional protections for religious organizations, and also understand that when I say religious organization in the civil context, there is a civil definition of that, which is different from the definition that you might hear Kate Brady use when she's talking about immigration. So understand that, and just recognize that, when you hear one of us speaking, we're speaking with the definition that is used in our own particular practice areas. Many of our topics that we cover here today, and in general in our practice, overlap and touch on multiple areas. So you will hear some of us speaking to the same issues, the same topics, but looking at it from a different light and from a different point of view. So that's something to bear in mind. So things that you want to consider if you're talking about what an imam, for example, might say from the pulpit, or even just, at a community event. What are some things that are good and that are helpful, and, that you can do, or that you definitely should be aware of and be leery of? And one of those is that not everybody is a religious employer. You can have a religious point of view. You can be founded or rooted in or based on a particular religion, or even connected with a mosque. But you might still not be necessarily a religious employer if the main parts of what that subset does, if it's separately incorporated, is in fact actually a community-based organization. So then there may not be as many religious protections, even though it feels like it, it seems like it looks like it, it's nearby, it's across the street, or it shares a parking lot. It still may not be quite the same thing. Also, something to consider is that not every role is one that is a religious role for individuals. And so there may be what's called a ministerial exception, which has additional protections, but that relates specifically to the job duties. And if the job duties require teaching religion, if the job duties require teaching particular religious views, if you're talking about, for example, someone who is like a front desk greeter or who greets community members as they might come in, that role is probably not a religious role. So that's something else to bear in mind. So if you've done those steps, there's still some extra things we want you to consider here. Consider that if you are a 501c3, so you are a nonprofit the way that most are, there is a limited room, a limited amount of leeway or limited cushion for what might be considered lobbying for particular legislation, campaigning for particular individuals, those sorts of things. And going beyond that might endanger your 501c3 status, even if you did everything that Sana and that Kate already said properly. So you don't want to overdo it on the lobbying that might end up putting you in trouble. It can be a risk to your nonprofit status. And then just the general standard stuff for good behavior does apply to nonprofits specifically as well. You can't call for any true threats. You can't call for violence. You can't incite violence. No hate speech. And no false statements that could lead to defamation. Defamation is broken down into two parts. It's slander if it's verbal. It's libel if you write it down. An email counts as writing it down. The internet counts as writing it down. So keep those in mind. And let's go to the next slide. Look at a couple of things. Okay, so on free speech, some things that you can bear in mind to handle when free speech issues come up in the employment context. And when things come up in the employment context, there are a couple of topics, main ideas that you want to keep in mind. If you have employees who are maybe speaking out, and you want to look first, one of the things that you want to look at is, are there policies that are in place? If an employee is speaking out and you're not happy with how the employee is speaking out, or you're uncomfortable with what they're saying and want to know if you can discipline them, the first question is to look and see if there's a code of conduct, if there are policies in place, if there's a handbook, if these were communicated in advance. And if they were, and if you uniformly and consistently apply that, then you probably are okay. If there are individuals who are speaking out and what they're saying, even if on their own time, is something that conflicts with, let's say, what you believe to be the beliefs of the organization. Again, that would loop back to whether this is a religious employer and whether that particular position is one that has to have a ministerial component to it. So it also, you want to evaluate whether the employee is speaking on their own time, that can pan out differently, and whether they're saying something that draws negative attention on the organization, not necessarily just unpopular, but onto the organization. For example, I could go out and I could protest and I could speak, but if I do it in my I Heart MLFA t-shirt, that's going to bring some different things onto me. That's going to bring some more requirements on me because I am holding myself out as a representative of my organization at the time that I do that. And that applies too for statements made online. If I do it under LinkedIn, if I do it under something where I identify myself as an employee of the organization. And then if we could go to the last slide, that'd be great. All right, so employment law compliance issues to bear in mind. I know there's a lot of words on that. We are going to make this available, and I'd be glad to follow up for people who may have questions as well. Compliance for nonprofits, again, just bear in mind, check your policies. The more policies you have, the better. That's something that I'm going to say consistently, and it's from the employment lawyer point of view, but also just general civil, because those are your insurance. Those are your safety nets. You also want to be careful with volunteers. Volunteers can get you in a little bit of trouble depending on how you utilize them. You don't ever want to have an employee volunteer to do extra time that involves the same job duties as what they get paid to do during the week. That's not volunteering. That's overtime. And these are the kinds of things that, while it sounds unrelated to what we're talking about right now, these are the kinds of things that we do see nonprofits end up being targeted for, because maybe you're not breaking any laws. You're probably not. You're not doing anything that is facially or obviously problematic. But if there is something that the government, a government agency, an enforcement agency can say, well, yeah, but you know what? A lot of people get this particular thing wrong. A lot of people misclassify their employees. So let's take a look at that. Is this person really an exempt employee? And then the last thing that I want to touch on is that you also want to look at some of the more, traditionally boring seeming things. Do you have health insurance, and are you complying with health insurance regulations? And there may be some state regulations that govern that as well, not just federal. Are you in good standing with your workers' compensation insurance? And at least here in Texas, where we are located, an employer that has one employee has to have workers' comp insurance, because if I were a solo practitioner, I might file against myself, hypothetically. So even that, you still have to have one. Make sure you've got your EEO notices posted and any other notices that you need to have up. Avoid perceptions of favoritism toward one employee or another, because that's the kind of thing that, while not necessarily because of any protected category, is going to lead to discontent in the workplace. And that's where the problems come in. And that's where people start making allegations based on other things. That's where you get more agencies coming in, and they start sending the longer and longer lists. And so I do, as we've said here today, and as Sana mentioned as well, you can't necessarily stop people from coming to investigate, or you can't stop an agency from coming to investigate. You can't stop an agency from sending you a request like the one that we said. It does not mean that you've done anything wrong. But what we want to do is put you in the best shape possible, so that if or when that happens, you're in a good position to respond and you've got everything in order. And with that, I'm going to pass it on so that you can hear about criminal aspects that come up as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Christy. My name's Charlie Swift, and I'm the Criminal Defense Department head. So you've heard about regulatory compliance, and that's incredibly important. Because if they can't get you for what I'm about to talk about, they go back to that. However, you need to understand, if you're going to give aid in the future or presently to Gaza, you need to understand the regulation structure. Next slide. First part is to understand the U.S. government doctrine concerning Islamic charities. What does the government think? The government has thought for more than 30 years that Islamic charities fund terrorism. Now, they've never been able to prove that, but they've believed it for more than 30 years. So back in the 90s, to combat that, they passed as part of the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Act, they passed 18 U.S.C. 2339B, and this is what we're going to talk about. Okay, next slide. So what does 18 U.S.C. 2339B prohibit? In addition to prohibiting the things that you would think, you can't send guns or bullets to terrorist organizations or provide them soldiers, 2339B, however, prohibits humanitarian aid to any designated foreign terrorist. The only exceptions to that are medical aid or medical supplies and religious supplies. That's it. In other words, feeding children can be a crime. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide, please. Well, I'm not sure that we're going to be able to go on from here, as it appears to me that the slides are frozen. So I'm going to talk to you briefly about 2339B. 2339B, as I said, provides for material support. What does that mean? Well, that means that in this context, you cannot provide any aid to a foreign terrorist organization. Well, what's a foreign terrorist organization? any group that is designated, that's foreign and designated by the Secretary of State. Now, that may sound arbitrary, and it probably is, but there's no ability to challenge it, at least not here in the United States. So if they're designated, the answer is the government said no, and you can't do anything, and there's no way to challenge that. Okay. Next slide. Next slide, please. I'm not sure what's going on. Anyhow, in this process, you can't challenge it. So how do you find out who is a foreign terrorist organization? Well, the Secretary of State publishes a website where all of them are. And your attributed knowledge, well, what if I don't know? I can't see it on the process audit. I'm going to pause for a moment. Jawad, can you catch us up? Jawad, we need to go forward a couple of slides. Okay. So coming back, so providing humanitarian aid to designated terrorist organizations is illegal, but it's not a big deal, right? Unfortunately, it is. 2339B initially punished a single incident with up to 5 years. After 9/11, it was increased to 15 years as part of the Patriot Act. After ISIS, it was increased to 20 years. So unlike other regulatory violations like the ones Kate talked about, this is a Class C or major felony. Next slide, please. Okay, I think I've got your attention. So what's a designated foreign terrorist organization? So you can stay away from them. Wow. What's the answer? It's any organization designated by the United States Secretary of State is a foreign terrorist organization. Where do you find out? Next slide, please. Now, is there any way to challenge the Secretary of State's designation? And as I said, well, we got a little technical difficulties. No, you can't. Next slide. Well, if I don't know that a group's designated, then you're okay, right? No, you're not. 2339B permits you to be prosecuted if you know that the group has committed acts of violence or other acts of terrorism. This includes attacks on military forces as well as civilians. So if you know of a group and they've ever engaged in violence, that'll be enough, whether you knew they were actually designated or not. Next slide. Though, I guess we need to find out. Where do you find out? Well, you visit, and these will be available, the Secretary of State's website at Foreign Terrorist Organizations. That's where you find out. Next slide. Okay, look, I don't want a history lesson. Just tell us if any groups in Gaza or the West Bank are designated. Yeah, here are the following groups are designated. Hamas, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Hamas is the #1 group. The other groups are fairly minor and basically don't exist anymore. But Hamas is the #1 group. Great. Nobody here wants to give to Hamas. I just want to help Palestinians. So we're good, right? Not necessarily. In 2005, Hamas won an election, and that's important and became part of the Gaza government. Based on that victory, the Secretary of State of the United States decided that there was sufficient, that the Abbas government was sufficiently controlled by Hamas that it was no longer an independent entity. In other words, well, why does that matter? Next slide. Again, you don't want to give to Hamas. I don't want to give to Abbas either. I just want to give to Palestinians. The problem is that charitable aid through NGOs in most instances is either directed or coordinated with the government. I want to stop here for a moment. That's a part is to get it into the country, you have to go through customs, to pass through a port, to distribute, to get a building, to have a place to turn it out. All goes through governments. And if that's present, then it becomes a big deal. Next slide. What's the problem? Well, in 2008, the Supreme Court decided in humanitarian law that aid that was either subject to the direction or provided in coordination with a terrorist organization it constituted material support to that organization. Most foreign aid, to some degree, is either directed or coordinated with the local government. So if Hamas is the government in Gaza, then aid that is either subject to their direction or provided in coordination constitutes material support. Okay, next slide. They wouldn't really prosecute anybody for this. I mean, they're feeding children. Well, I have bad news. They have. In 2008, the United States prosecuted in the U.S. versus Al Mazin, otherwise known as the Holy Land case, secured convictions for feeding children and providing other humanitarian aid under the direction and coordination of Hamas. So they will prosecute for humanitarian aid. Next slide. Okay, this is really bad. You're saying there's no lawful way to provide aid in Gaza? What's back? No, I'm not. In 2006, the Treasury created a way to provide aid lawfully in Gaza and the West Bank by issuing a series of licenses that allow the government to coordinate, government coordination and direction if the coordination, and this is important, and direction was exclusively with the Abbas government. Okay, next slide. Where can you find a copy of those licenses? Well, OFAC has a website. You can go right there. These again will be available. Most licenses on the website are listed by country. However, the United States doesn't recognize either Gaza or the West Bank as a country. Take that up with the government. Instead, the licenses related to these are listed in the counterterrorism section. Next slide. These licenses are legalese. How can anyone understand them? Well, that's a good question. OFAC recently put out guidance concerning the licenses, and that guidance is consistent with what we've been telling people from the beginning. As far as understanding the particular license, an organization needs to get legal advice and assistance. To our knowledge, the major organizations that have been working in Gaza prior to October 7th have existing legal advice and guidance. If you need help understanding a particular license, contact us by submitting a request, because we help organizations do this. Next. How is it the charities have been providing aid in Gaza and the West Bank? Well, in brief, for the most part, these charities deliver aid through agents that have been authorized and vetted by the Abbas government. They have no connection to Hamas officials. These agents operate through Gaza and the West Bank. Okay? If we don't have an agent yet, is it easy to get one? This is some bad news. No, it isn't. It requires working with the Abbas government, and this is a difficult time to do it, quite frankly. Next slide. Well, if Hamas isn't in charge of Gaza anymore, what happens then? I don't know. The structure of Gaza, because it looks like in the future, because Prime Minister Netanyahu is not saying what Israel's ultimate ends are beyond the destruction of Hamas. So I have no idea what the government structure is going to look like in Hamas, and no organization can. And so what many organizations are doing is getting aid together for the idea that we're going to be able to provide it at some point. Next slide. What if we just use a GoFundMe campaign or similar to send money to individuals in Palestine who need it? This is something that we've seen on the web. We've seen it in masjids. We've seen it other places. Is that unlawful? No, but it's not risk-free. The concern when sending money to an individual is whether the individual is a member of Hamas, or will use the money to help Hamas. It's important to understand that if the individual receiving it is a member of Hamas, the government takes the position that Hamas received it. Even if the purpose of the money was for the individual to pay their rent or to buy some food or something like that, even if they were relative, they take the position that that was material support. It's also difficult to trace whether the money was actually spent for its intended purposes, even if they're not. This is definitely not the way to send large amounts of money. Next slide. Okay, I got it. I'm not going to send money to anybody who's part of Hamas, but I've seen all these GoFundMe campaigns. Am I safe giving to them? Well, initially we recommended against this. However, and this is important, we recently learned that GoFundMe is now requiring further verification that aid related to the current crisis in Gaza, West Bank, is sufficient, or it meets the funding requirements, the regulatory requirements, e.g., they're requiring that you prove that you vetted the individual, that they're not connected to Hamas. Overall, we view this as a positive step forward, because instead of simply forbidding GoFundMe campaigns, they're requiring vetting for it. And that makes us a lot more secure. However, if you have a GoFundMe campaign or you start one, expect to be interrogated by GoFundMe. And that's where we can come to help you. Next slide. And that's right. Next. If you have particular questions, that's important on this, is that you go to MLFA.org and apply for help on a GoFundMe campaign. We can help you first, before you ever do it, come and call us and ask us for advice on doing it, because we know what you need to have set up to provide funding to individuals through one of these publicly facing campaigns. And you need to be prepared in advance before getting into it, because later on, you don't want to be in a position where you're having to explain to the government, no, I didn't intend to help Hamas in any way, et cetera. This wasn't a terrorism finance campaign. Because remember, the government starts with the presumption that it is. And it is incumbent on the organization to prove that it wasn't, or that they complied with the license that authorized it. And that's how you have to think. You have to think that the government starts out with a belief that all money going to Gaza is funding Hamas. And you're going to have to be able to show and prove that it wasn't. And even if it did, it went through a licensing regime that permitted it. Next slide. I leave that now for questions for anyone in the group. And that's just not just for me, that's for everybody. So please, let's go on to this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julie, Sana, Christy, and Kathryn. Thank you to all of you who have joined us today. Sorry, Charlie, for those technical difficulties. Jawad's screen froze, and so sorry to throw you off. And thank you, everyone, for your patience. And with Charlie Swift always rolling with the punches. So without further ado, I wanted to address some of the questions. I understand we may not get to all of them, but please note that we have already recorded all the questions, and we will be adding the answers to our website, and we'll be sharing the slide deck. So all of this information will be available to you. And in the next little bit, we will try and go over as many questions as we can. We may extend it just a little bit. For those of you who are interested, you can stay on. For those of you who need to go, please know that this information will come to you in other forms. So question number one, I think this goes to Kathryn. Can we have students who are here on student visa volunteer their time for mosque responsibility?
So what I would say is that most students are not authorized for outside work. Some may be authorized through their programs to do work that's related to their programs. But if the responsibilities are voluntary positions that no one would be paid and other members of your mosque would be doing as volunteers, that is likely okay. But if you are having people do things that are, we're going to save a little bit of money by having a student do it, which we would normally do as a paid responsibility, that is a gray area that I would try to avoid.
Thank you, Kate. The next question I see here is, can an imam or president or announcers of a C3 say demand ceasefire, or call your elected officials for supporting ceasefire or promote human rights? Christy, I think this one's yours.
Yes, and I will say on that one, as far as call whoever your elected official may be to demand ceasefire, that is probably fine. As attorneys, we're not going to give you definites and absolutes, but realistically, depending on the language and depending on the structure and the context in which this is happening, that it is almost definitely going to be acceptable to do that, because calling for a ceasefire is not necessarily advocating for a specific position and a specific a specific individual and it's not petitioning a specific legislator or anything like that. So if it's just, the general hashtag ceasefire, that's everywhere, that's all over. And so particularly, I would recommend, though, for anyone who wants to do those sorts of things, loop it back and tie it back to humanitarian issues, referring to citizens, not to a particular political group at all, but referring to citizens, humanitarian aid, referring to the United Nations, referring to the Red Cross, referring to things that are recognized, effectively neutral organizations. Those I think would be good to do.
Great. Anybody else want to add to that, or are we good? All right, we'll go on to question number 3. What constitutes hate speech? Since many are talking any pro-Palestinian speech to be anti-Semitic.
I'm going to send to Christina for that one too.
Yeah, that is. I was hesitating to just jump right back to the mic, but that is a civil question as well. For that one, I would say, what constitutes hate speech is a little bit in the eye of the beholder. It is a little bit up to the courts to decide what they believe that it is. But simply saying, I don't like this one individual is not going to do it. Some examples in the case law would be that if you are saying this one entire group is a problem, this one entire nationality is a problem, things like that are difficult to defend. That gets trickier. And it is hate speech more if you are taking it any time that there is more dehumanization, and any time that there is more of an othering, such as not referring to a particular ethnicity or nationality as human. That is something that is much more likely going to be considered hate speech, or the generalizations that we have to get all of them, they are all out to get us. That kind of stuff is hate speech. You're right, whoever the questioner is, that there are there's a lot of presumption. But again, I would loop it back to traditionally neutrally considered sites and information. There's even a lot of stuff on the Department of State website, which is one thing I've been referring people to recently, that you go to the Department of State's website, you can look up the 2022 Religious Freedom Report, and there's a lot of stuff in there that would be favorable and says a lot of what people are saying on behalf of Palestine right now. Citing to that, it's a little difficult to say that the Department of State is engaging in hate speech. So with that, I'm going to pass it along for the next question.
Thank you, Christy. I think this one goes to Charlie and Senna, so whichever one of you want to start. What nonprofit orgs are okay to support for Gaza? What features should we be looking out for when we mention an organization's name? And Charlie, you want to take a start, and then we'll pass it to Senna to close us on that one.
Yes, it's a great question, but a difficult one to answer, because the first part is I'm going to talk to you as a donor. You as a donor can give to any organization that's a registered 501c and the reports that it can lawfully do these activities. In other words, part of your requirement as a 501c3 is to be honest on the web, that you're in compliance and engaged in lawful activities. And the donors to that organization are entitled to rely on it. Now I'm talking to you as an organization. If you're advertising it, then you're saying that you can and are doing it lawfully. And the important part on this. Now I'm aware, because I've worked with, but I'm not, they haven't authorized me to allow this to say things with several different organizations that are doing it. And in each case, they have been giving it lawfully under the general licenses. If you have concerns, you should address that question directly to the organization. It would be great to give you a list, and we look forward to the organizations coming to Asana and we can put them on it. But until they do that in a formal capacity, I'm not comfortable saying any organization is lawful per se. But the important part is that you don't have to have that. If they're advertising it, they're a licensed 501c3, as opposed to an individual or a GoFundMe campaign. You have no such protections in the GoFundMe campaign. The organization, you have the protections because they are required to be honest and lawful in their communications. And that's why it's very important to go to SANA if you're an organization, because you can be held liable on those things. Number two, I'm going to have another part is, What if I'm helping an organization by having them come to my masjid or with my organization and jointly fundraising with them? Well, that's a little different. You should ask them a lot more questions. And we're here to help you do that. Because at some point, especially if you're sharing revenue, you become a partner. And a partner, in criminal law, we have a different name for that. We call it co-conspirator. And you don't want to be a named or unnamed co-conspirator if it turns out they're not doing it right. So, you need to ask a lot more questions if you're helping them fundraise than if you are, in fact, just donating. So those are I wish I could give you the absolute answer. It's impossible because I need to know which we are doing in the regulatory compliance. But I am aware generally that the largest ones all have independent lawyers, legal committees, and have done their due diligence and work under the general licenses.
Thank you, Charlie. I'm going to jump in just calling that it is 5 o'clock. For those of you who need to go, please feel free to leave your questions. Know that we will answer your questions, have this recording and your questions answered on our website. For those of you who can stay and you have more questions, our team is here and we are willing to stay a few minutes over time just to make sure that we can address as many questions as possible. So again, for those of you who have to leave, thank you for joining us today. We will share this information with you further. And for those of you who are with us, we will just continue to answer a few more questions before we close for tonight. Sana.
So just to follow up to Charlie, going back to the question of what nonprofit orgs are okay to support for Gaza and what features should you be looking out for? Obviously, I mentioned the C3, but beyond that, again, if you have questions, go to the organization directly and ask them. And one thing that Charlie mentioned actually in the last town hall that we did was try to find organizations that have an established practice of providing aid to Gaza already before October 7th. I would say that's probably your safest bet, that they have already jumped through the hoops and have had, relationships on the ground in Palestine. So really look to those established organizations who've been doing the work, for years before October 7th.
Thank you, Sana. Christy, I think this one's for you. Recently, there was a discussion in the ways.
I had one more piece on the Q. Wait, I had one more piece on the Q4.
Sorry,
Can I just add one more thing to
again? Go ahead.
That on that last question, because I think there's an immigration component that's okay. There were some charities, and we've talked about Holy Land Foundation, that were prosecuted in the last 15 to 20 years, and immigration is a much lower burden when it comes to the immigration agencies, and they have imputed some of that knowledge to people who have volunteered and donated, and you could lose your immigration status, be targeted for removal from the United States, or prevented from getting additional immigration benefits if the government thinks you knew or should have known that even those 50, those charities that are already registered, if they were doing bad things. So I'm just going to say the government's a little sneaky on that. So you're less risk, but there's not no risk. And I'll pass it on to the next question.
Thank you, Kate. I hope everyone understands why we have these 4 departments. A lot of these issues do overlap, and they have different consequences depending on which lens you look at this issue with. And immigration is very important to our work because a lot of our communities are immigrants or have family members who are immigrants. And we know for a fact that those issues are used when these cases are being worked through. So thank you again, Kate, for jumping in and addressing it from that perspective. So question number 5. Recently, there was a discussion in the Ways and Means Committee about AMP. Can we donate to AMP? That stands for American Muslims for Palestine. They are an advocacy organization and AJC, they're C4. This is definitely a Christy answer.
Yes, this is, and I'll be very brief on this one because I do want to also reiterate, we are not here, we're here in an educational context right now. Today with this presentation, we are not here advocating or fundraising for any one particular organization in any way, shape, or form. It is also no secret that we have been counsel of record for AMP for many years now. And so I do want to say that we are continuing to represent them. We're good with that. All of our legal positions are public on that. I would reiterate to you, just go ahead and look, like Sana said, and as others said, look at the website of any entity that you may want to donate to. Look to see whether they raise funds from outside the United States where there is higher risk, or whether it is funds from within the United States where there is lower risk. And look at what they say, where they say they spend their money. Do they give disbursements? Do they give disbursements overseas, which is not necessarily, as the other departments have mentioned, not necessarily a disqualifier, but you have to be more careful. Or do they only spend their money within the United States? Those are things to look at in determining who you want to donate to. So we do appreciate that question, and I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Christy. Question number 6. Do you provide guidance for nonprofits who receive a grant from an organization outside of the United States?
Please call us. I definitely need more information from you. But yes, definitely give us a call or find us on MLFA.org, and I would be happy to have a consultation with you.
Thank you. And it looks like this may be our final question for the evening, unless Jawad tells me otherwise. Question 7: Can I run a GoFundMe campaign to put billboards in various state highways, promoting ceasefire, advocating the citizens to call elected officials to do the right thing?
I can start, and then maybe Christy can take over. So I definitely need more context before we can give a straight answer. Are you a C3? Are you a C4? Because then that gets into differences between advocacy and lobbying. The second part of your question regarding advocating the citizens to call elected officials to do the right thing definitely falls into the lobbying category, which is more in line with what a C4 does. A C3 is allowed to do some of that, but it depends on how much money you're spending, how much volunteer time you're using. So there are rules and regulations around how much a C3 can lobby versus a C4, which is meant for lobbying. And then as far as the content of the billboard, I'm going to pass that off to Christy.
And I do want to follow up very briefly here. Again, as far as the content, following up on what I had said previously, I think the more general that it is, not that you can't support a particular topic, you can, or a specific reason, you can. But the more that it is something like the hashtag ceasefire, that is good. If it goes further and it links to a particular lobbying organization, that's going to be something that will be looked at more closely. But if you're simply reciting facts, and again, if you can say that these facts came from the United Nations, they came from one of the humanitarian groups that is in Gaza, that is international, and that is not, that is recognized internationally as being a neutral aid organization, and you're quoting them, and you have that even in little tiny font on the comparatively little tiny font on the billboard, that's something that will put you in a much better position, keep you much safer, and you can still do your point of view. Again, as Sana said, we need to look at specific facts, specific language, because we can't give, a guarantee overall without seeing the actual wording in the full context.
Thank you, Christy. Charlie, did you want to say anything?
Yeah, I'll weigh in on that last one, echoing Christy's point. One of the advantages where you do hear material support thrown around is organizations say that if you're arguing for the same viewpoint as Hamas might argue for, that you're materially supporting them. Remember that direction and coordination element. Independent speech is absolutely fine from a criminal perspective. What Christy puts in is a safe haven too. I got my viewpoint from a neutral third organization. So if it happened to match what something Hamas said, no one could say that I'm operating under their direction and control coordination. So again, we echo the idea of don't repost Hamas's requirements in this or any other terrorist organizations, because sometimes they have political opinions that you might agree with. But instead, use a neutral aid organization, and there are lots of them that have the same opinion.
All right. Thank you, Charlie. I was going to push it to one more, but I think the questions are getting a little bit more specific. So I think they'd be better off being answered in writing for all of you. So I will take the lead and end our session today on that question. We have recorded all your questions, so please do keep them coming. We will answer them. We will have this recording and the forms on our website for you. I just want to thank our team for their dedication and for their work, not only over the past 22 years, but over the past 45 days or so. We, again, were created to serve you in this purpose, and we are here to do that. Please make sure you call us, reach out to us, use our website, our intake form to ask us your questions, and so we can educate and protect you before we ever have to defend you. Our dear community, I want to leave you to say that the more injustice you see, the more oppression you see, the more terror you see, know that our resolve will be stronger. We are here as your legal backbone. MLFA educates, protects, and defends. Please reach out to us for any and all questions. And thank you again for joining us today. Thank you to all of you, and may God be with. Bismillah.